Hello. For this supplementary podcast for the Philosophy of Religion module, I thought we'd look at the watch analogy that's often promoted and associated particularly with William Paley, who used to be a clergyman back in the 1700s. It's an idea we didn't get much chance to look at during the lectures because we were covering other subjects. In a modern context, there are a lot of criticisms made of the watchmaker analogy, although it does still have some currency, for example, with the American creationist movement and so on. But even amongst those who regard it as a flawed analogy, it's still worth knowing, simply because of its place in the historical chain of arguments that have been made in favour of justifying the existence of a deity, and how that relates to some more modern theories. So we'll just take a simple look at this concept. So William Paley argued that, the short version of the argument is that if you were walking along, minding your own business, and you came across a pocket watch and saw it and examined it and looked at it, and you could see all of the cogs and what have you inside, and let's assume you didn't really know what a pocket watch was, this was an unusual thing for you, you'd see all of those moving parts and the intricacies inside it and see how complex it was. And the chances are you wouldn't think, unless you were, let's face it, a little bit strange, you wouldn't think that this had just, all these cogs and parts had just fallen out of the sky and miraculously landed in that pocket watch in perfect order to make it work. This thing existed by sheer chance, as just a fluke of fate. Whereas if you were walking along and you tripped over a rock, which is also Paley's analogy, you might well think, and possibly be completely correct, that nobody had actually as such put that rock there. It had just fallen there or been moved there by the flow of great icebergs during the Ice Age or whatever else. It needn't be there for a reason or on purpose or because someone had created that rock or anything like that. It would just be a random event. Whereas the pocket watch is engineered, it's made, it's created, and further, it has a purpose. So even if you didn't know what a pocket watch was, you would study it and examine it, and eventually you'd probably realise that it was there to tell the time. That's what the function of a pocket watch is. The analogy that Paley made was that if you look at some other aspect in nature, for example, let's say the human pulmonary system, or how the eye operates, something like that, you could say that is an incredibly complex system. It's detailed to the finest degree, it's very involved, it's as sophisticated, probably a lot more sophisticated really, than the workings of a pocket watch. If the pocket watch shows signs of having been created, of having been designed, by implication, Paley argued, then surely the human body or the body of a cat or a dog or any other one of a million different species is also designed, because it's so complex, so involved. Paley argued, how on earth could this come about by random blind chance? So it's a little bit like laying a blank canvas on the floor, throwing a load of tins of paint up in the air, and they splatter all over the canvas, and it, by some freakish miracle, turns into the Mona Lisa. You could throw cans up in the air a million times and they still wouldn't form the Mona Lisa, they just make a mess. You could probably flog it to the Tate Gallery, but it wouldn't form a cohesive image or representation. So you look at a painting, you look at a pocket watch, etc., you see the work of the artist, of the person who has created it, and you know it is a manufactured, intentional thing, and not just a random splotch of colour on a paper or a random few cogs that have all landed together and somehow formed a watch. So a lot of people, Paley wasn't the first person to make this argument, but he certainly promoted it and became well known for it in one of the books he wrote in 1802. It's been used to argue what these days is called intelligent design. the idea that the whole universe is so complex and so involved and everything is so sophisticated and in perfect balance that surely, some people argue, this must mean that there is a creator deity, someone who has designed and created and put everything where it needs to be to make sure it works. It therefore surely cannot be just some freakish weird chance, as, for example, Richard Dawkins isn't saying it's blind chance, it's a process of trial and error. So all of the things that didn't work have fallen by the wayside, and the things we see now are the small percentage of things like bodies and evolution and so that did work. So he's not saying it's random chance, but mindless chance in that sense, a sheer fluke. But equally, he's saying that there is no need for there to be a creator deliberately designing, deliberately engineering, putting everything into place just so. Because the idea of a creator putting everything perfectly into place would mean there would be no failed experiments in evolution. So there wouldn't be creatures that lived for a short period of time, couldn't adapt, couldn't survive, their bodies didn't work well, and they just died out, became extinct. That, as such, wouldn't happen if there was a deity or some other profound mind that was putting everything into place exactly as it needed to be. There'd be no trial and error, because it would be done perfect first time. Unless you want to go off on some weird tangent and argue it's all aliens or whatever else way, that might allow for them making mistakes and making errors and then retrialing, but that's slightly outside the remit of philosophy of religion for the moment. So, in understanding that argument, whether you agree with it or not, just in terms of understanding what Paley was trying to say, because it's an attempt to justify that there must be a deity because nature is so complex. At one level, it's what can be termed an appeal to nature, which is a philosophical argument, which also has some problems with it, but put that to one side. We'll come back to that in a future lesson, or maybe a podcast perhaps I'll do on that. An appeal to nature, in terms of what you need to know for the moment, is the idea that the natural world is good and wholesome and perfect, and therefore you look to it for a model of how things should be or ought to be. So Paley is saying, look, the physical world is a good place, and it's everything works and it's proper and so forth. Therefore, it's a sign of intelligence at work. Of course, it doesn't quite account for the fact that viruses and earthquakes and volcanoes cause misery and suffering and pain. Paley's ultimate argument wasn't that God had designed the world to be all lovely and all good and all nice, and that the dark, destructive things he obviously acknowledged did exist, rather than deny them. But his argument was there was more good than there was suffering. Which is I suspect, down to personal experience as to whether you believe that or not. If you've lived a very hard life, you might have a real struggle accepting that one. But his argument was that the good outweighs the bad. Therefore, it's a sign not only that God is intelligent and intentional in his design, but also benevolent and kindly by making the world predominantly good and minimising, he argued, the suffering, the misery and the happiness of viruses and germs and dangerous wild animals that might attack you and that sort of a thing. So there's an element of trying to explain both the intelligence of God, but also the benevolence, the kindness, the goodness of God by referring to nature and both its complexities and its pleasures and its joys and its good parts in the natural world. So there's that. When it comes to looking at the major schools of thought that we've been discussing in class, Paley's argument is a teleological one. Just to briefly revisit that, teleological arguments are based around the notion that certain things in life, ethics and moral codes and how to behave and so on and so forth, have purpose. It comes from the Greek word teleos, which was a goalpost in racing that the charioteers that was like the pass line at the end of the race. So when they went past the telos, they knew they'd won. So that was what they were aiming for. A teleological argument says that whatever it is that you're discussing, in this case creation, has a purpose. It doesn't just mindlessly exist. It's not random. It's not there for the sake of being there. It's got a purpose. It's got a function. It's got a use. Therefore, Paley was saying that God has designed the universe to have function. Each thing in the universe exists for a function. Therefore, each one of us, arguably, has a purpose. We're not just here to use oxygen and eat a lot. We're here to do something specific. God has a purpose for us, and you have to find out what that is, and so on. And that's what gives life meaning. It's what gives life purpose. It's what gives life a sense of direction, I suppose, that you are aiming towards an achievement. He doesn't entirely account for what happens if you achieve it early and then you sit around twiddling your thumbs, but that's a separate issue for a separate time. So it's just placing the pocket watch argument in the context of what he was trying to say about the intelligence of God, the goodness of God, and that life is purposeful, because just as the watch has a purpose to tell time, so he's saying that anything which is very, very complex, like the weather systems, the way our bodies work and so forth, has to have purpose and function. You could argue, people such as Darwin and so on have argued that the purpose of life is to reproduce itself. So once you've reproduced yourself, you've passed on your genetic code to another generation. That's you done, in a sense. It's not obviously a profoundly spiritual purpose, but it is a purpose. Paley's implication was that the purpose of life would be something a little bit more spiritual than just having kids. But in and of itself, teleological arguments do not exclusively need to have some deep spirituality about them. They're simply the idea that everything serves a purpose, understand what the purpose is, and it gives context, it gives meaning, it gives direction. Hopefully that is useful for you as an addition to the lectures, and if you have any questions, do ask them in class or email them to me, and I'll get back to you. Okay.